Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and today I am in an E60 BMW 5 Series, a 545i, which is a very, very rare car. And I think the perfect car to illustrate the significance of the E60, but not always in a positive light. So let me explain. This was really a brilliant car, and yet it managed to dent BMW's reputation. Let's start with what made it so good, and then I'll explain why it has such a controversial reputation today. Now, just before we get started, Paul, who brought this car, thank you very much for bringing it down, buddy, confused me slightly when I got here because, to all intents and purposes, it looks like an Alpina. When I first saw it, I thought, oh, okay, it's got an Alpina, a couple of little Alpina bits. Then I saw it's got the Alpina, sort of the little center boss. It's got the Alpina badges on the seat. It's got badging in the engine bay, and I thought, wow, this is a proper Alpina. I think it was a B5 at the time. But no, the chap who had it before, Paul, decided to go quite a long way into making it into an Alpina replica. So this is still a standard 545i, apart from the wheels, body kit, and the interior bits. Now, the E60 had the unenviable task of replacing the much-loved E39. It started off very, very well, in that it was a car which was roomier inside than its predecessor, but it actually weighed 80 kilos less. The way they achieved that, or at least in part, was by having a lot of the bodywork at the front, so the bonnet and the wings, in aluminium rather than steel. There was also the handling. Now, the E39 was a great handling car, but this took it to a different level. For a big saloon like this, it really was a revelation. This is an SE model, so the setup is quite soft. It is supremely comfortable, and it does feel like quite a big, heavy car. And yet, when you chuck it in the corners, even this luxury version just corners really very flatly. It's quite uncanny. I think the main difference I can see between this and a Sport is just that there is a lot more sort of vertical up and down undulation, but it must be the geometry, the suspension setup they had at the front, which has it resist sort of tipping into corners too heavily. For a BMW as well, the steering is really rather nice. I believe this is still hydraulic. It's nicely weighed, it's not overly light. The speed is well judged, and now that we're a little bit in the hairpins here, it's so nicely balanced. The auto gets a little bit in the way of playing with it in the corners because it's quite hard to have it in the right gear. Even if you have it on Sport and the manual selection, it still shifts by itself. But let's just take it through, because the engines are something else which are worth talking about. Excellent turning circle for a big car, and foot to the floor. Switch the DSC off so we can play a little bit more, and really sweet turn in, and then the front end clings on as long as you stay on the throttle. Let's see what it's like through the really tight twisties here. Will it be in the right gear for this? I hope so. It is turning down, yeah, okay. It is hard to get that gearbox to cooperate. Little bit of pivot there, but very gentle, very nice. Didn't feel out of control. If it was a manual, that would have been even more controllable, I think. Now back to the engines. This has the V8s. This and the 6s were just brilliant engines. The 8s, I think, would be my pick, although they can be a little bit more troublesome than the 6s. This is a very rare car. It's the 4.4. 330 horsepower, but more tellingly 380 Newton meters of torque. So it's a really effortless car to drive. This version of the 5 Series was a technical tour de force as well. So it introduced things like active steering, so speed sensitive steering. I think the speed of the steering would vary depending on what you were doing. Active headlights, head-up display, regenerative braking, lane departure, sort of control, all that kind of stuff, which I have to be honest, personally, I don't like at all, most of that. But anyway, it was, you know, there was a lot there. It also introduced the iDrive as a way of sort of controlling the menus and all those kinds of things. So very much sort of an advanced car for BMW as well, and it used aluminium suspension components like the previous car. There's a precision about the steering and also a feel which to me is absent in the E39s. These are definitely more sporting cars. So far, everything I've said, it's just a marked improvement on the previous car. It's a very good car. So what went wrong? Okay, well, the first thing I think we need to talk about is the design. The E39 is a very, very complete car, especially in certain specs, certain wheels. They look very good. And it maintained BMW's sort of the evolution of BMW's design from since the 1960s, really, the family feel of BMWs. When Chris Bangle came on board, did the 7 Series and then this, he literally just took BMW's design language, lobbed it in a bin and just set fire to it. It's not just that it was a radical departure. I do agree with, I think, the majority that say that it didn't look that good. It wasn't just incredibly different, which it was, but it still doesn't quite work for me. I'm not one of the haters. There's people who really hated this 5 Series design. I think that they can look pretty nice, really, especially when you see this one, which has all the Alpina bits on it. I think this is one of the best looking E60s that I've ever seen. But overall, in terms of looks, it was a big step back and people didn't react very well to that. Another big minus of this series of cars, which weirdly doesn't seem to be affecting this, even though it has those big wheels, is they were criticised for the ride. I guess the sports versions in particular, but there was a big issue as well with the run flats. I think it was one of the first cars to use that generation of run flats. They made the ride very, very fidgety, and some drivers weren't impressed. Then we come to the interior. In this particular E60, I think this is the nicest E60 interior, and it's kind of going to go a little bit against what I'm planning to say, but having experienced other E60s, including one that my stepdad had with the aluminium trim and so on, it just looked cheaper. And the lovely thing about BMWs is that without being showy, the interiors always had a certain amount of class about them. And this was the first 5 Series that didn't have the instrumentation angled towards the driver, something that I think was a big own goal. And the way it's designed is interesting, but the materials generally seem to be of inferior quality. The build was inferior. It seemed to stand up less well to everyday use. I must say though, especially like this, where there isn't a huge contrast between the dark wood trim, the plastics, it does look pretty nice, and it hasn't aged as badly as some of the other trim options that you can get. This was one of the first iterations of iDrive that they came with, and it seemed to infuriate most people. I personally don't find the iDrive to be that much of a chore. It is annoying for some of the controls, but it's fairly intuitive. All the same, people hated it. And in this car, Paul has put in an Apple Play, sort of Android Play headset, which completely just negates that and helps keep the interior. It makes a massive difference in keeping the interior looking quite modern. Matter of fact, I'm really quite impressed with this car, despite the fact that I'm saying the E60 overall damaged BMW's reputation somewhat. Then the other problem is the engines. Now the 6s were generally pretty good. The 8s, like this one, weren't quite as reliable as the inline 6s, but on the whole they weren't too bad. What really did hurt its reputation were the 4-cylinder engines. There was various issues. I think the most well-known is the timing chain stretching. My stepdad, as I said, had one of these, and he was quite happy with it when he first got it. He couldn't believe his was a sport tourer. Couldn't believe how well it handled. But that love affair was short-lived because he soon started having issues with the parking sensors and other electrical gremlins. Now, these are very sensitive to batteries. If your battery isn't in tip-top condition, you can have all sorts of that kind of stuff happening. So I think over time, some of it has been resolved, but they are definitely still quite capricious cars. And I think that's quite significant really, because part of the reason why people bought German cars is that, generally speaking, they gave you less problems and less issues for things like this in terms of fit and finish, interior quality, electrical gremlins than the Italian cars and French cars. And the E60 really suffered from that. If you want a nice luxury car, I think Paul is thinking of selling this, and I think he's going to ask about 6K for it. If you're interested, I'll put it in the video description. To me, it seems like a massive amount of car for the money. I don't know too much about the prices of E60s, but it drives incredibly well. If you want a luxury orientated 5 Series, then this is absolutely brilliant. If you want one of the sharper ones, it would probably have to be a Sport. The seats as well, although very comfortable, quite lacking in bolsters on the side, but overall, really, really lovely car and a lot for the money. Thank you very much to Paul for bringing it down. Thank you very much to all of you for watching. And let me know what you think about the E60. Was it BMW's biggest mistake? Or is it much maligned for no reason? Was it a good step forward? Certainly, I really like this car. I think it's incredible value. And the fact that it has that body kit and those wheels, it's definitely the most attractive E60 I think I've seen. Thank you all so much for watching, and see you for the next one.